Hello chess friends and welcome to Azarov's chess channel and welcome to a very important tournament that started today. It's the Skilling Open. It's a very cool tournament between 16 best players now these days. Really I think we'll enjoy now the couple next days. So the format is like this. We have the best players: Magnus Carlsen, young Nepomniachtchi, Liren, Alireza, Firouzja, Hikaru Nakamura, really the top elite grandmasters battling for the throne. And first the concept is like this. First the 16 players will play a round robin. Then when the round robin is over, then the best 8 players are staying in the tournament and they will play a knockout stage. So today we're starting the tournament with a very intense match game between Jan Nepomniachtchi and Magnus Carlsen. It was really a wild one because we're thinking it will happen. Of course, we'll come to that on the end of the video. So let's check out now what happened. The Jan played here with the white pieces, opened with the move e4. We have e5 by Magnus. Knight to f3, knight to c6, bishop to b5, the Rui Lopez, and we have now knight from g to e7, the so-called Kozio variation, Kozio defense, which is of course the main idea about this defense is to get this reloading system after bishop to c6, knight takes c6, so we don't risk to go now into this popular exchange variation that's played many times. Bishop takes c6, then you force maybe to play d takes c6 or b takes c6. You have a weakened pawn structure, and then white's main goal is to build maybe a blockade on light square. So this Kozio defense I have played several times. It's playable, but the problem is now you would love to, of course, to play the move f5, and in the normal f5 ideas, like in the King's Indian, for instance, when we try to move f5, we want to have the knight here, then we want to have the knight on f6. We don't want to have the knight where it's targeting on the same square like the pawn. But okay, it's playable. As I said, it has been played in top grandmaster level many times. Interesting choice by Magnus Carlsen. I think he hasn't played this opening now for a while. In the game, knight to c3 played by Jan Nepomniachtchi, and we have knight to g6. Here d4, immediately cracking the position. We have e takes d4, knight to d4, and Magnus plays a very aggressive bishop to c5. There are of course also some knight to b3 lines, but here bishop to e3. It's similar now to the Scotch game, where we are basically battling for a d4 square. In the game, Magnus tried bishop to d4, bishop takes d4, and now queen to g5. Sort of a exchange variation. The problem is now, of course, after bishop to g7, rook to g8, and queen to g2 will follow. It leads also into a very complicated game, so that's why here g3 played by Nepo, and we have now knight to d4 by Carlsen. Queen to d4. Okay, let's stop and evaluate the position. It's of course to notice that white is slightly better here because white has a centralized queen. White has the space advantage with the pawn move e4, has good activity with the minor pieces. What the bad part is there are maybe several light square problems in front of the king, so that's why the main goal I think should be here to castle queenside, not to castle on the king side. Then after d6, this bishop's activity could be very problematic for white. So in the game, knight to e5 played by Magnus, threatening of course to fork on f3. Here bishop to e2, we have knight to c6. Magnus finds of course a good way to remaneuver his knight and attack the queen. Queen to c4, and now d6. Knight to d5, of course attacking the c7 weakness. Magnus has to retreat. Queen to d8, and now queen to c3, attacking the pawn on g7 and kingside castling. Okay, let's again stop and evaluate a little bit the position. I really love now white's position because white is now ready to castle queenside. White has a centralized knight. White has a good activity with the light square bishop on both diagonals. White has a 4 versus 3 situation, so 4 pawns against 3 pawns. White can make maybe some progress with some f4 moves, maybe f5, g4, h4 ideas, really crack the position. In the game, as I said, queenside castling played by Nepo, and the cool part about this game that we have now the so-called opposite side attack game, which means of course both kings are on opposite sides. So now the main strategy is attack your opponent's king. So easy as that. So in the game, here rook to e8 played by Magnus, of course attacking the e4 weakness. That's why f3, and with the move f3 we're locking a little bit the light square bishop's activity, but it doesn't matter. I think still white is slightly better because we have still opportunities to play g4, h4, g5, h5. I think we're a little bit faster, and here bishop to e6. So what's the goal about this move? We want to, of course, play bishop to d5 after something like rook to d5. After e takes d5 is not possible. You lose the bishop on the e file. But when the rook is centralized on d5, then maybe you could have some tactical problems. Then the rook can be also an object of our minor piece attack. So of course, so far it's not so good to have the rook on a weird square on d5. So that's why Nepo plays a very interesting idea, bishop to b5. Of course, now after bishop takes e6, bishop on e6 takes knight on d5, then we have e takes d5, and we can use the fork by the bishop on the knight. So here bishop to d7 played by Magnus, and now h4, creating this flank attack. As I said, in this opposite side attack games, when we're attacking our opponent's king, who is faster will probably win the game. So a6 played by Magnus, and here comes, I think, now the main mistake, the first mistake by Nepo. He plays the move bishop to a4. A better idea is probably to get the bishop back, bishop to e2, and maybe if bishop to e6 again happens, then we could have something like rook to e1, protecting our bishop and also protect maybe our pawn on e4, then maneuver maybe even the bishop to f1 and try our f4 pawn breakthrough motif. But here Nepo plays the move here bishop to a4 and gives now Magnus Carlsen really the opportunity to get an attack, because Magnus plays immediately b5. And here I think in this opposite side attack game, as we mentioned, we want to be faster on our attack. Now it's suddenly with this move that Magnus Carlsen is slightly faster, slightly better, maybe bishop to b3, and you see now we have immediately the opportunity to threaten the lock the bishop with the move a4. So that's why Nepo has to play the move a3, weakening the pawn structure in front of the king a little further, and Magnus plays now b4, immediately cracking the position, although it's a pawn sacrifice. But in this opposite side attack games, as I said, who is faster, it's simply about tempos. And now with the move b4, Magnus gets a huge activity on the a file, because there is always this threat to play rook to a1. After a takes b4, we have a takes b4, Magnus takes, knight takes b4, and pardon me, Nepo takes, knight takes b4, and here Magnus makes, I think, also maybe his first mistakes. He plays knight takes b4. A better idea is knight takes e5. When you have sacrificed the pawn, maybe, then it's really time to complicate positions, not to simplify positions, because we have sacrificed the pawn. I think Nepo loves this idea to get rid of the knights, because then the position is more and more simplified. After knight to e5, maybe something like rook to e1 can be played, but now queen to b8, we're simply attacking further. We have now also some threats to play rook to a1. The king has to be on a weird square, king to d2. But I hope you realize when we trade off the knights, the position is not so complicated anymore. That's a huge difference, and now I think Nepo has equalized the position. In the game bishop to e6, Magnus again forces further trades of pieces, which is, I think, not so good. The evaluation is now slightly better again for white, because Nepo simply takes bishop takes e6, rook takes e6, and what Nepo is trying to do now is, of course, go into a favorable endgame where we have simply a pawn up. So in the game queen to c3, we want to protect our dark horse. We want to finally also play b3. Rook to a1 doesn't bring so much. We will simply play king to d2 and we'll force the trades of rooks. Then we can compete again on the a file, where basically the whole battle is present. And here Magnus blocks the king side with h5, which is of course good. Here Nepo can threaten something like h5, and then maybe he can make progress with h6, splitting the pawn structure in front of the king, opening some files, opening this long diagonal for the queen. So the queen is much better of whites. The queen on d8 is of course not good, doesn't have a good activity, and in the game Nepo plays finally this move b3. The main idea is of course to regroup, play king to b2, and then play something like rook to a1, competing with this annoying rook on the a file, trading off more and more pieces, and as I said, going into a simplified endgame. f4, rook to g6, f4 here played by Nepo. We have rook to a6, and now king to b2. we have rook to e6, c3, queen to c4, which was now again maybe not the best of moves by Nepo. Maybe again rook to e1, trying to hang on to our position. If something threatens us, we can play rook to a1, compete on the a file. As I said, maybe taking this game would be slowly would be, I think, a good idea. In the game, queen to c4 was played and gives now Magnus Carlsen again some counter-attack possibilities with the move queen to f6. You have left your defense, and that's, I think, a huge problem, because queen to c3 doesn't work here. You get a very nice tactical shot, rook to a2, deflecting the king from the defense of the queen. So that's why here c3 was played. There are also some ideas, queen to d4, again forcing further trades of pieces. In the game, as I said, c3 was played, and now rook to a8 by Magnus. Still, white is better here. It's not a problem about that, although it seems like a strange setup here. The king is a little bit vulnerable to black's attacks, but as I said, simply trading off pieces is perfectly fine here. Rook to e1, we have queen to e7, and now rook to d5. This is now the main mistake of Jan Nepomniachtchi, because what Magnus Carlsen realized, of course, is now the tactical threat here to make progress with queen to a3. And pause the video, maybe try to find now. It's basically a winning move here for black. It's a huge mistake here by Nepo to get this rook exposed. As I mentioned in the beginning, okay, maybe if you have some tactical ideas to create a rook lift, rook lift, when you have maybe some tactical opportunities, the rook lift is perfectly fine. But the rook in the center can be really an object of our opponent's attack, because here c6 was played by Magnus Carlsen, kicking away the rook. Queen to c6 doesn't work, because you get queen to a7. You lost really the battle on the a file. You cannot get back with your rook, you get queen to a2. So in the game, rook to d4 was played. Even if you try something like rook to d1, you get a very nice tactical shot, d5, attacking the queen has to retreat. And again, this idea, queen to a7, if you try, for instance, to compete now finally with the rooks, it's a little bit too late, because the queen gets to f2 and it's game over. You have to leave the defense of one rook. You see, you have to get your king to the first rank, and you lose either this rook or this rook. It's game over. So that's why here rook to d4, but still it's a bad game. d5 anyway, played by Magnus. We have queen to e2, queen to a3, queen to c2, and now queen to a2, attacking the queen. Here, maybe the best way for Magnus is to play d takes e4, because what we can notice about this move, that we are opening the d file, and that's very important, because if you try rook to e4, then you get checked, and after king to d3, this other rook comes into the game. We have opened the d file. Very, very important tactic, which unfortunately for Magnus, he missed rook to d8. Then after something like king to e3, we can simply take rook takes e4, king takes e4, and now rook to e8 wins the game, of course. You see, many pieces are on the same file. It's game over. But Magnus, after the move king to c2, played queen to a2. It's not a problem, still a winning position here for black. After king to d3, we have queen to b3, and now comes really the critical moment of the game. Queen to c2, played by Nepo, and here Magnus played a mouse slip, queen to b4, and lost the game, and resigned immediately. Ooh, incredible game. First, I think Nepo solved his positional problems, made then the huge blunder with this rook lift, allowed Magnus Carlsen attacking opportunities. Now Magnus regrouped, found really at least some kind of a tactical good line, but now he made this mouse blunder and loses the game, and has now, I think, a very problematic situation immediately in the beginning, because in the next round he faces also Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, again with the black pieces. So okay, this is our first game of this tournament. I've created a new playlist of this tournament. We'll follow now this tournament, I think, very, very hard. I think it's a very important one. Great players are participating. The good thing for me is that one of my favorite grandmasters, Levon Aronian, is also playing. We'll see how he will perform also in this tournament. Okay, as I said, this will be the first game. If you want to see more commented chess games by me, check out my commented chess games. Here's the link. And if you want to see maybe the best engines playing, check out my commented chess games play by computer series. And if you like this content, you can also subscribe to my channel. See you soon with some more videos, and chess is the best, of course.